I'm going to start with some sad goodbyes, actually, before we go into, but I wanted to put them on the public record, so I hope you'll bear with me on that. And I think particularly the committee wants to put on record our thanks to Gabby Cohen, who I can't believe won't be here after nearly 20 years of absolutely consistent attendance here in this committee room. And really, I think from all the committee, thanks for the fantastic work you've done down the years, Gabby, and lots and lots of luck and good fortune for the future. And I also want to say goodbye to two of our members who are voluntarily departing. Austin, who's been a member of the committee, we're trying to work out for 10 years? 10 years, we think about 10 years. And Anne, who's been a fantastic member of the committee, left us but loved us so much that she came back. Again, have been both of the really effective, great members of Parliament, and it will be sad for you, for us to lose you as well. So all the best to both of you for your future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. This is the last hearing. Can you believe it? I wanted to start really asking you about something. I don't believe everything I read in the papers, but I did read a statement from you in the papers about the HSBC Falciano leaks and the information contained therein. And you did say in this, you're quoted as saying, so it's really an opportunity for you to tell us whether it's true or not. I did not then, so presumably when you were at HMRC, or at any other time, get involved in decisions about HSB investigations. You're therefore wrong to associate me with accountability performance in this area. Is that true?
Yes.
So are you really saying that when you were head of tax and these the leaks came in from the French authorities, that you never got involved in any way in any discussion or around how they should be treated, what they contained, anything like that, anything at all? It's just very hard to believe, if I'm honest, Mr. Hartnett, it's hard to believe.
Well,
because you were head of tax at the time.
Madam Chair, let me explain. I got involved in these ways. I had several discussions with the French before the disc was ever available. I had some meetings with senior people in HSBC, but I did not get involved at all in how the material on the disc should be treated or how it was treated. And there was a simple reason for that. There was an incredibly important separation of role between the Director General for Enforcement and Compliance, me, and other Director Generals in the department to preserve the integrity of the investigations that were taking place.
Well, what were your discussions with HSBC about then?
Sorry?
What were your discussions with HSBC about?
Mr. Mitchell, I can't say much more than Lynn Homer said. I saw them on the 10th of February 2010
Did you discuss at that? Did you discuss it at the Falciano leaks?
I was just about to say, Madam Chair, I saw them on the 10th of February 2010 to say that we were aware from the media and from the French that there was leaked data which Mr. Falciani had taken, that we were interested in it, and that tried to find out a bit more about the relationship between the UK and HSBC Suisse.
Can you go on and explain that a bit more?
I don't think I can, Madam Chair, because Lynn Homer has made it very clear she is not prepared to go into detail about that note, and I am therefore restricted in exactly the same way.
Madam Chair, can I just ask, can you give us a flavour then about how much of that information fell within the jurisdiction of the UK tax authorities? Are you able to give us any more?
I came away, I think I'm really, Ms. Hillier, going right to the edge of what I can say. I came away from the meeting with an impression that this was entirely an HSBC Suisse issue, which HSBC UK would be trying to clean up.
Okay. You see, as you get into, I've seen some of the material in those leaks, and if you say you didn't see it, your staff would have done, because it was passed to them in April, wouldn't they?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Your staff would have seen. I have seen the material on the leaks.
Yes.
You say you never saw that material.
Absolutely right.
But your staff would have done.
Those involved in criminal and civil investigations who were part of Project Solace.
Right. Well, I want to distinguish. We'll come to the issue about individuals. I want to distinguish between the individuals and the bank. Because what stares out at me pretty quickly, and I'm not a tax inspector, neither am I a sort of lawyer in any way, but what comes pretty quickly with an ounce of common sense to it is that the bank itself was heavily involved, heavily engaged in advising its clients on both evasion and avoidance. And indeed, the bank was probably involved in, as you will have seen in some of the cases in the press, in quite actively in money laundering. Now, if your staff, those staff that you say were responsible in enforcement, had read them in the simple way that I had, they would have sussed that. And you, as the head of tax, they must have come to you to discuss not the individual prosecutions, not the prosecution of individuals who had accounts in the Swiss bank, but the issue of the bank's own complicity in helping, aiding and abetting individuals to avoid paying their UK tax.
Nobody came to talk to me about that. That would have been contained within Project Solace. If they wanted to talk to a board member about that, they would have talked to the Director General for Enforcement.
Then why on earth did you go and talk to HSBC in the first instance about it?
Well, because I was really interested in all things Swiss at that time, if I can put it that way. Towards the end of the summer of 2009, I had completed the work I'd led on the Liechtenstein agreement, and Liechtenstein had provided us, or the working towards the agreement, had provided an enormous amount of information about Swiss banking in general. I had then approached the Swiss Banking Association later that year to see whether we could do something similar in Switzerland as we had done with Liechtenstein. The Swiss Banking Association, if I can put this slightly colourfully, was shoulder-charged aside by the Swiss government, and I was then heavily involved in discussions with the Swiss government. I had hoped that the discussion on the 10th of February might provide further insight into Swiss banking.
But
That
Mr.
was my
Hartnett,
purpose.
what is just incredulous to me is that you get involved on a discussion which leads to an Anglo-Swiss agreement, which we'll come to in a little while, that you know that there is data in the department for which
Not at that time, Madam Chairman.
You did know. The data came in April.
Yes, and I had the meeting in February.
You had one meeting. You had several meetings.
Yeah,
Lynn
over a
Lynn
long period
Homer
of time.
talked about half a dozen meetings. She talked about half a dozen
Okay.
meetings, not one. So it wasn't just a February meeting, it was half a dozen meetings down the line. You had meetings with HSBC, you knew about that, you were negotiating an Anglo-Swiss agreement to, it's incredulous you didn't, I find it hard to believe that you didn't discuss the details of what was in those leaks with the Swiss, with the bank, with the HSBC. But even if that's true, you would have needed to have known the content of that to make a sensible agreement in the taxpayer's interest in your negotiations on an Anglo-Swiss agreement. You needed that knowledge to be able to define the parameters and the clauses of that agreement. Surely.
No, Madam Chair, I didn't need that agreement. We had a great deal of knowledge about Swiss banking by the start of our negotiations with the Swiss. HSBC Swiss wasn't the only Swiss bank that HMRC had become interested in, and there was a long history of obtaining information about individual Swiss accounts and the behaviour of individual Swiss banks. And I can think of 2 or 3 other Swiss banks that in the previous 5 years I'd had or led discussions with, rather than had personally led discussions with, over their behaviour and performance.
When we talked to you in October 2011, and the chair then asked why there was a difference between the way that tough way you treat single-parent tax credit receivers who are overpaid and the way you treat rich people. You said that we know the people who've been overpaid tax credits and can address that. But we do not know the identity of people in Switzerland, and we cannot establish who they are. And you then said, that's your justification. The chair then said, that's your justification. And you said a very smart reply, I think. That was a pragmatic solution to a long-standing difficulty. Smart reply.
Thank you.
But you're then presented with a gold mine of names and addresses and information about all these people who are rooking the tax system by having Swiss accounts handled through HSBC, and you do nothing about it. I mean, it's incredible.
But it wasn't for me to do anything about it, Mr. Mitchell. There was a team in Project Solace dealing with that. I'm nearly 3 years out of all this, so I'm having to work from memory. But as I recall it, there were tens of thousands of UK residents with bank accounts in Switzerland. If we got data, and we did get data, there was HSBC Swiss data, there were other lumps of data, if I can put it that way, it still got nowhere near the totality of the information. And that's what the Swiss agreement was trying to address. The Swiss made...
But you've got a lot of information you can proceed on here.
But they were doing that, Mr. Mitchell. Project Solace was actually doing that, case by case.
I have to say to you, if you're negotiating the terms of an agreement on how they are going to release information to you about the tens of thousands or however many Swiss bank accounts there are, the nature of... you would have not been doing your job properly, Mr. Hartnett, if you hadn't had regard to the nature of the data you knew about from the leaks in determining the clauses in the agreement. You would just, it's incredible to me that if you didn't know, you should have known, and I think you did know, and it should have influenced you.
No, I'm really sorry. I didn't know the detail, and what we were trying to do.
What do you mean by detail?
The detail of the Falciani information.
Did you know that there was extensive advice being given by the bank in Switzerland on how to avoid the European Savings Directive? Did you know that?
I didn't know.
Extensive advice.
I did not know.
Not to more than one client, many clients.
I did not know for certain, but...
But did you know? You didn't know for certain. That's a bit of a...
No, I did not know. Well, let me explain. I did not know for certain. I knew that banks in Switzerland were, in a sort of wholesale way, trying to take their clients around the European Savings Directive. Why did I know? Because there'd been lots of discussions in Europe about this, and one of the things that was really important to us when we were negotiating with the Swiss is that we didn't do anything which repeated the sort of colander-like approach in the European Savings Directive. We needed something secure. And if I can just go back to something you said earlier, please. We weren't trying to get individual pieces of data from Switzerland. Even the Swiss president engaged with us to tell us we could not have a disclosure of individual data. So we were trying to negotiate an agreement that brought us the money without the data because we couldn't get the data.
There are two areas where I think I personally find it difficult to believe and understand your action. First is that you claim that you didn't know anything. Well, let's go back to the meetings. Let's go back to these meetings that were HSBC. Lynn Homer has refused to give us detailed information on what occurred in that meetings because she says that they were operational. Okay? And in being operational, one understands that they were those meetings talked about the Falciani leaks and how they were going to be dealt with. What else is meant by operational?
I don't know. You'll have to ask Mrs. Homer that.
Well, so you've got to answer that question, Mr. Hartnett. You've got. It is. Did you, in those meetings, in any way discuss the Falciani leaks? Yes or no? Did you or didn't you? That's nothing to do with in any way undermining the confidentiality of individual taxpayers' interests. It's helping Parliament make sure that we get an efficient and effective HMRC that brings the money in that is due to the HMRC. Did you not talk about the Falciani leaks?
I did not personally discuss any data from the Falciani leak.
Did you talk about the generality of the Falciani leaks?
One of my colleagues who was with me let it be known that he would want a separate discussion with HSBC about the data because he was one of the directors leading Project Solace.
Did you not have any understanding at all what was in those Falciani leaks?
No detailed understanding.
No, but what understanding did you have? No detailed understanding. You're hiding behind weaselly words.
I'm not trying to. I mean, HMRC, I'm sorry, I'll probably get the initials muddled up more than once here. HMRC has set up a project team of 300 people to deal with the Falciani data. Initially, I seem to recall, it looked like 6,000 names. As it was refined, because there were problems with the data, the numbers came down. This had to be significant. I could not recall HMRC or the predecessor departments setting up a project on that scale before. But I did not need to know the detail, nor did I seek to know the detail.
Go on.
I can understand that there would be Chinese walls or more in the department. But were there at any point, as you were dealing with the policy on this, which was important and a big achievement to get that agreement, were there discussions about what policy areas this threw up that might be helpful for you in negotiating that agreement? Yeah, look, we've had all this stuff from from HSBC. There's some big holes here that we need to make sure we plug in that agreement. That kind of conversation.
One of the big policy areas was clearly to learn, generally, because we knew a lot about it, from the weaknesses in the European Savings Directive.
Yeah.
I mean, even the Swiss wanted it improved because it leaked so much. So that was one. Another was because of the sheer scale of Operation Solace, we were determined through the agreement with the Swiss to get some specific disclosures going forward. And we got 500, I think, a year on a sort of ratchet arrangement. If it dropped below a certain figure, we'd get less the next year. If it went above a certain figure, we'd get more. And we were determined to break down the Swiss resistance to specific information. Those are the sorts of policy areas. But I think, as you'll recognise, they were big general policy areas and involved really, what's the right word for it, fraught discussions with the Swiss to get movement there.
Do you have senior board level discussions at HMRC about the work you were doing on the Anglo-Swiss agreement so that other colleagues could pile in with their thoughts from their areas of expertise around the department?
We had one or two relatively brief board level discussions, but I had a governance board which I set up and chaired, which involved the Treasury as well, because these were important issues.
How often did the governance board meet?
Can I go to Stephen?
Can I just ask how often?
When you finish, then I've got Stephen David Austin.
How often did the governance board meet?
Once we were relatively confident that we would have a chance of getting an agreement, I think we were meeting something like fortnightly.
Okay, and who was on? I mean, you might not tell me the names.
I can't remember the names, but I can tell you the roles.
Yes, roles.
There was me chairing it. There was the Director General from Enforcement and Compliance. There were the directors who'd been involved in negotiating the detail of the Swiss agreement. There was the tax director from the Treasury. Sometimes I think there was a second person from the Treasury.
The Treasury always do that. Sorry, shouldn't be.
There were others who had a compliance focus to their work. It was a big group of about 16.
Okay, thank you.
Stephen Hammond, then David, then Austin.
In response to Ms Hillier's earlier question, you said right at the margin of what you could say was that you were impression that the HSBC Swiss was the problem. On that basis, what conversation did you have in future about whether or not HMRC had conversations with Mr Mears, who was the global head of private banking?
I'm sorry, I haven't understood the question.
Well, Mr. Mears was directly in charge of HSB Swiss for HSBC. Yes. So either, I'm presuming you're going to tell me that that was a Project Solace basis.
I'm afraid I am.
Okay, well then, if it was a Project Solace basis, then, touching on Ms. Hillier's second group of questions, a lot of what you would have understood from that feeling would be policy areas, and to inform your discussions about policy, equally it would have been right to have called Mr. Mears to come before you to explain how, as the global head of private banking, direct control of HSB Swiss, he'd allowed this policy to exist.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to follow Lynn Homer again. I can neither confirm nor deny, Mr. Hammond, that Mr. Mears was at any of the meetings with the senior management of HSBC. That's the position I find myself in.
Who was at the meeting?
Madam Chair, I can't say that.
Why?
Well, because I have been told that Lynn Homer has said as much as she can about those meetings. And I can't go in a different direction. I'm bound by what she has said.
Ridiculous. I cannot for the life of me see how that's got anything to do with protecting the taxpayers' interest. Can you? Anybody around the room? I think what it's got to do with is not telling us the truth and the whole truth.
I'm sorry, I am telling you the truth and the whole truth. I wouldn't come here and say anything else.
But you can understand our frustration.
Indeed I can.
In that we're not actually asking you to disclose the detail of the conversation. This is a specific question about who was there. And that clearly can't impinge, surely, on any of the confidentiality or commerciality of what was said. It's a simple question of, who was in the room at the time.
And accountability, that's the frustration, isn't it, all the way through, is the lack of accountability.
Yeah.
And the lack of accountability on individuals, and particularly on the part of the taxpayer who's lost millions.
Yeah. My understanding, I will check it as soon as I can, is that Mrs. Homer has declined to name who was at the meetings, either here or at the TSC. I will check it.
I don't think anybody's asked her, actually, to be fair.
If
I don't think we asked her what was discussed. I don't think we asked who was there.
Perhaps we should accept Mr. Hartnett's offer to check it and perhaps write to the committee,
of course,
confirming one way or other whether he, and preferably disclosing who was at those meetings from HSBC.
I will do that as soon as I can.
Well, you have to do it before Parliament dissolves.
Yeah.
I have to get hold of Mrs. Homer first.
Well, I think she'd probably get hold of her.
Firstly, just pick up, you mentioned about the European Union Savings Directive. You said it described it as being leaky. Was that
very
leaky? Back in 2008, Mr. Mears said in terms of the impact on his tax clients that he didn't see any real impact. Why do you think he said that in the light of disclosures?
I would guess because he, like many other bankers, had clients who were skirting around the directive. Let me say this, which may help. I was shocked when, in the context of the Swiss-UK negotiations, I found how little the UK was getting from the European Savings Directive. And that really encouraged us still further to make the Swiss agreement as tight as we could.
How did you find that, Mr. Hartnett?
I asked.
Who did you ask?
I think I got that information from the Treasury.
But the Treasury knew how much we were getting from the Swiss bank?
No, from the savings, through the Savings Directive.
And in terms of the lack of impact on those tax clients, would you put that down to any particular custom and practice at HSBC, or would you put it down to what Lynn Homer describes as a culture in the mid-2000s when banks and other institutions were aggressively marketing avoidance schemes?
I would put it down to a general approach by banks, particularly in Switzerland, who found the Savings Directive provisions so full of holes they could just walk through them.
Would you include HSBC in that description of banks?
I don't know, but other than what I've read in the newspapers and in front of the committees, it seems to have been.
But obviously you were in your position at HMRC.
Yeah, but I didn't deal with the detail, Mr. Burrows. I worked on the assumption when dealing with the Swiss agreement that all banks were trying to take their clients through or round the savings directive.
Okay.
It was in the media regularly how weak the savings directive was.
Can I just pick up on, just going back to the point about the your response previously in 2011 about this pragmatic solution in terms of the difference between targeting tax credit avoidance, let's say it, and these other avoidance. Just understand, would you like to change at that previous response to the pragmatic solution? Now that there is the disclosure of individuals, you seem to be saying it was pragmatic because of the lack of individuals being identified. That's what you said previously.
Yes.
So how can you understand, now that there is an identification of individuals, how do you justify that previous response? I still don't get it.
Part of having the pragmatic solution and getting the money, as it were, we said we wanted some disclosure. What we actually wanted was full automatic disclosure of the sort that will come in 2018, I think, in Switzerland, through common reporting standards. That's what we wanted, and it's what we couldn't get.
And with the clear identification of individuals, you still think it's justified to go through the disclosure agreements process?
I haven't understood the
So in
disclosure.
terms of now, with individuals being identified,
Yes.
that it's still quite appropriate to follow through the disclosure facilities.
Well, the Swiss-UK agreement will become completely redundant when common reporting standards comes in, and the disclosure process that we achieved was just for 500 when there were tens of thousands.
And you said in 2011 that people on the HSBC list could face penalties of up to 200%.
Yes.
And have any been subject to penalties of 200%?
I retired at the end of July 2012, Mr. Burrows. I don't know.
By 2012, had any?
No, because the cases, I think, were underway then rather than being completed.
Which cases?
The cases that HMRC was investigating from the HSBC.
One case that went to court.
One went to prosecution. There were lots of civil cases.
I mean, you said, I think, in that, or there's a note, maybe Rob can show me at it, there's a note that HMRC put out in your name, where you talked about 500 cases.
Yeah, page 26.
In your page what, 26?
Yeah, 13th of October 2011.
Okay. Do you want to, shall I, huh?
In terms of the...
At the top it says HMRC. Yeah. This was 13th of October 2011. You were in charge. I think it's in your name, this. HMRC has already begun criminal and serious fraud investigations into more than 500 individuals and organisations holding these accounts. And then later on it says... if they do not come forward, HMRC will begin an investigation into the affairs, which could include a criminal investigation or result in penalties in certain circumstances up to 200%. That was 11. You were there beyond that for another 9 months.
Yes.
We now know there was only one case.
Well, that's the position as at the 13th of October 2011, as I understood it to be. It was important to be as transparent as we could about what was happening, because in that way we hope people would come forward.
And you said the net is closing on offshore evaders. Do you think the net closed quick enough and firm enough?
Can I do it in this way, Mr. Rose? Can I look back over a few years? It certainly has closed pretty quickly over a few years. The tax world for offshore has changed dramatically. One of the conversations I used to have with this committee and the TSC when I appeared before it in the past is the speed or lack of speed in bringing cases to conclusion, particularly criminal cases. And I think Mrs. Homer said 44 months on average to get a case to the CPS. That's something that's sort of gone in the opposite direction. I was, if I can put it this way, in the last century, a criminal investigator and a manager of criminal investigators. The world was completely different. people pleaded guilty and took their punishment. That doesn't happen in tax anymore. We used to get through cases in about 18 months. So that's changed in another direction. Like the committee, I would like to see criminal cases brought forward and resolved quickly.
Why under your stewardship weren't there more cases around this issue? Why? You had the names, you told the committee that it was the lack of names, the failure to have identification that prevented you from taking action, yet under your watch there was only ever one case.
Madam Chair, you keep saying under my watch. I was not the accounting officer, and I did not have an accountability for enforcement and compliance. So it wasn't my watch, and that'll sound like Weasley words, but that's the truth.
Yeah, but when you say in a statement that the net is closing on offshore evaders, it's still under your watch 9 months after that statement, and you still need to be held to account for the progress made.
But I'm really sorry, Mr. Bowers. Maybe I'm missing something. I wasn't controlling the cases. The investigators had their own governance arrangements with the Director General in Enforcement and Compliance, not with me. He reported to the Chief Executive, not me. That was the accountability line. And I'm not here to try and get off the hook. I'm afraid I was never on the hook for this.
When did Leslie Strathy go off sick? Just out of interest. You were actually responsible, Mr.
October 2011.
Yeah, quite. And between then and when you left in July 2012?
No. Between then and Mrs. Homer arriving, I was the accounting officer, but...
Which was when? 2012? July 2012?
No. January 2012. I was the accounting officer for about 10 weeks. I shared the responsibilities, because I had to do my own job, with the chairman, and the chairman was the person who took most interest. I technically was the accounting officer, and I don't want to to try and get out from underneath that. But the chairman was the one who looked after enforcement and compliance, not me. I took my interest. My big interest was personal taxation.
Well, then a final question, and then I'm going to go to Austin. But why on earth were you the person who negotiated the Anglo-Swiss agreement then? If you had no responsibility in this area, why did it fall to you to negotiate? You had no responsibility, no knowledge, nothing except what you read in the papers, and yet you negotiated it.
That's just not right. My responsibility was at a high level for negotiating an agreement with Switzerland. That was not. I had the experience to do that.
Why? You had no knowledge. You said you pushed yourself out of the knowledge base, so you were negotiating an agreement without any knowledge.
I'd certainly seen before, and I've said this afternoon, plenty of examples of problems with Swiss banks, fraud through Swiss banks. We tried really hard on more than one occasion to extradite people from Switzerland. I think we managed it twice.
But you didn't know anything about it, Mr. Hartnett. It wasn't in your job.
No, I've not said that at all. I'm really sorry. I haven't said that.
You said you didn't take enforcement actions against individuals. It was not in your job. It was another directorate. Now you're saying, I knew all this, and that was what informed the way in which I negotiated the Anglo-Swiss. You can't have it both ways.
I'm afraid I'm not seeking to have it both ways. I'm explaining what I knew about the Falciani data.
You are seeking to have
and
it
I'm
both
explaining what I knew about Switzerland. And I think, as Ms. Hillier has picked up, the Swiss stuff was very substantially policy-oriented.
Yeah, but policy based on what?
Policy based on wanting to open up Switzerland.
On what? On what evidence?
As we had opened up Liechtenstein.
Yeah, but on what
and
evidence,
we had
Mr.
learned...
Hartnett? Either you had the evidence and therefore you knew what was in data such as the Falciani data, or you didn't have the evidence, in which case you're not competent to have done the agreement.
Well, I'm really sorry. I have to refute both of those. I didn't know...
So you did have the data?
I didn't know the Falciani data in detail. I had the relevant experience. I'd led on Liechtenstein, and I'd led on discussions. Let me give you a different example, Madam Chair, if I may.
No, you've got a policy based on practice.
I'd led on other things. I had tried to open up a double taxation agreement with Panama because we were very worried about the beneficial ownership of Panamanian corporations owning land in a real property in London. I started it. It was a policy-driven issue. I didn't need to know the detail of Panamanian companies. You could go to the registrar of companies or the land registry and see the issue without knowing what was behind it, but I knew what had to be done. I went to Panama, I engaged with the Panamanian government, and then I passed it on to others.
I'm aghast.
I'm sorry.
I'm not aghast yet. But I am learning so much about Switzerland that I shall probably have to yodel my questions if this learning process goes on. But as part of the agreement with Switzerland, they got a clause, an appendix, which is a kind of comfort appendix, saying it's highly unlikely that professional advisors, Swiss paying agents and their employees would be subject to a criminal investigation by HMRC, and you put that in.
Yep.
I think you agreed to that. Now, did that affect or influence the decision you made that nobody from HSBC was to be prosecuted?
Well, I didn't make any decision like that, and I'm not aware that HMRC made any decision like that. But let me explain why it was there. This was a huge red line for the Swiss. They didn't want their paying agents and others prosecuted. It was a red line for us as well. We wanted to be able to prosecute paying agents and the like from Switzerland if we could get the evidence. Nobody at that stage, and we had data from other banks, nobody had seen evidence of a quality that would have enabled us to prosecute Swiss paying agents. Might have been able to prosecute UK paying agents, but not Swiss paying agents. And that's why it was...
Well, if you wanted to prosecute, why include that clause?
Well, because we knew we weren't going to get there, Mr. Mitchell, at that time.
Okay.
We knew we weren't going to get there.
Well, on the point we've just been making about penalties, at the time it was decided, HMRC announced that it would, this is October 2011, it would begin an investigation into their affairs which could include a criminal investigation or result in penalties in certain circumstances of up to 200%. Mm-hmm. You said this is not an amnesty. There are no special rates of penalty or interest. In fact, they were given special rates, weren't they? They were given the rates under the Liechtenstein agreement, which was less than they dropped you for.
If they could get within the Liechtenstein agreement. Can I put it this way, Mr. Mitchell?
Well, were any charged at 200%?
I don't know. But let me put it this way, because this is important. You raise an important point, if I may say so. One of the things that worried HMRC a lot on getting the so-called Falciani data is whether everyone would be able to come within the Liechtenstein disclosure facility and no penalties or very little penalties would be paid, and there might be problems in other ways as well. And that's one of the reasons why there was a sort of challenge letter issued to a large number of people in relation to the Falciani data, so that that would have meant they were under inquiry, and if they were under inquiry already, they couldn't go into the Liechtenstein disclosure.
They couldn't?
They could not. If they were
Was that a board decision?
No, I think it's in the detail of the Liechtenstein agreement.
So was there a board discussion on on whether the false people who had been revealed under the Falciani list for avoiding or evading tax could take advantage of the Liechtenstein agreement? Was that a board decision?
I don't think it was a board decision.
Were you involved in that decision?
No, I don't think it was. I was involved in the creation of the Liechtenstein disclosure facility, which prevented people under investigation in the UK from going into the facility.
And were you involved at all? I mean, one of the interesting things when Lynn Homer gave us evidence was, and we'll check it when Edward Troop comes, was up to 1,000 people took advantage of the Liechtenstein Agreement to get out of it, get out of any action on avoiding or evading taxation. I'm interested in whether you were aware of that, whether you knew that, whether you were involved in discussions as to whether that was a...
I don't recognise what you're saying.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that I don't remember having any discussions about that.
If you think of the number of people involved, the amount of money involved, would you not have thought that knowledge that actually people get around it by exploiting the Liechtenstein Agreement might have been something that you have had a tax on a policy matter, if nothing else, would be involved in?
Well, let me have another go at explaining, if I may. We designed the Liechtenstein disclosure facility so people under investigation in the UK could not take advantage of it at any stage. The challenge for Project Solace was to be able to say that the people for whom they had data were under investigation and therefore could not go into the Liechtenstein disclosure facility. Some did.
Many did.
I don't know. Some did.
Well, if you'd read the evidence, you'd have seen many did.
Well, my knowledge is that some did. But that was why there was a bulk issue of letters to people for whom there was Falciani data, so Project Solace could say they were under investigation, and therefore they couldn't use the Liechtenstein disclosure.
So why did so many use it?
I don't know the numbers, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Well, it's up to 1,000. It's a bit unclear, but it's between 500 and 1,000.
I didn't know that.
There must at some point in the department have been a discussion about that. I can't believe, because you're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds, I can't believe that at some point there wasn't a discussion about it in which you were engaged in.
Madam Chairman, there are only two things I can say about that. I do not remember a discussion like that, and I did retire almost 3 years ago, and there's been a lot of activity.
Well, we are looking back at matters from 2008 with a list that it was only leaked recently, but it was in your hands, or in the department's hands, 2010. And
can you imagine how a small business in my constituency, sitting listening to this, must wonder where the even-handedness is in the treatment of this particular small business I'm actually thinking about just now, where I think HMRC acted pretty unreasonably, pushed them into bankruptcy with additional liquidation fees, etc. And the way in which we are talking about these big, wealthy individuals or companies. Can you imagine what sort of impression that gives about our tax collection and pursuance within the UK?
I'm afraid I can. I mean, I've dealt with small businesses that have got into real difficulty. I think the answer is with both the Liechtenstein Agreement and the Swiss-UK Agreement, we were getting money we would not otherwise have got. That's the crucial issue. I think it must be dreadful for someone struggling every day to keep a business going to hear about these vast amounts of money. But the vast amounts of money were an honest attempt to try and bring in money we couldn't get in any other way. And other countries have called these arrangements groundbreaking, and some have followed them.
Mm-hmm. Would you also accept that we've heard quite a bit today about Chinese walls, and that is actually quite difficult to understand, that within one department, essentially, HMRC, the Chinese walls were so solid that some of the information that frankly the rest of other parts of Europe might have been talking about somehow didn't penetrate those Chinese walls. It's probably one of the few places where there was not also Chinese whispers as well as Chinese walls?
Well, Chinese whispers about individual investigation cases from the Falciani list did not reach me. I didn't want to know. I've been a criminal investigator. I knew the importance of avoiding any challenge in court where the investigator is asked, did you come under pressure to do this, that, or the other? I had nothing to do with it.
My third point is, given where we are just now, given the mess that we have seen over the last few years, given that you were previously a gatekeeper, what would you have done differently to prevent us getting to the situation that this is your third, fourth, or can't remember how many appearances you've had in front of this committee, and many on this particular subject, as well as your former colleagues. What could or should have been done differently? With the benefit of hindsight, which always gives you 20/20 vision.
Indeed it does. Whether it could or should have been done differently, the one thing that would have made a huge change is if bodies like the OECD had moved much faster to bring in things like common reporting standards and the like. I can remember it.
That's a nonsense. They've been working on it. The OECD have been working on this since the 1980s. We visited them twice. And the reason that in the end, the OECD can provide the evidence to governments such as ours, and it's up to us and other governments to respond to what they've done. We didn't. And you, as representing us in fora like the OECD, could have been a mover and shaker in getting stuff managed more quickly. You weren't.
I'm sorry, Chair, I have to disagree with you. We didn't have the evidence. And what's emerged in the last few years is evidence of a quality that has moved the world.
What evidence didn't you have?
Sorry?
Mr. Hartnett, just be consistent. You've told us a minute ago that actually you didn't need the detailed evidence that was in the Falciani leaks to be able to negotiate the Anglo-Swiss agreement, because you knew there was a load of stuff going on and you knew that money was leaking out of the European saving union. You didn't need the evidence. Now you're telling us, actually, we didn't have the evidence. So OECD, you couldn't have put pressure on the OECD, who I know, they told us, this committee visited them. They have been working on these issues of rewriting international rules to make them consistent with globalisation since the 1980s.
Well, I think, Madam Chair, that the UK can take some credit for agreements like the Liechtenstein agreement, which broke open Liechtenstein. All their banks signed up to it, their government signed up to it. I've said this to this committee, I think, before. Had I been asked whether I ever thought something would happen in Liechtenstein in my lifetime, never mind in my career, I would have said that would be the last place. These events have moved countries on. The discussions that have taken place in the OECD Forum on Tax Administration.
Well, don't attack the OECD OECD, Mr. Hartnett. It's just unfair. It was this government and others across that didn't respond to the initiatives being taken by the OECD. You should have the grace to admit that.
Could I bring you back to what more could have been done to investigate the issues once you had been aware, not necessarily in detail, but in the generality, of the information from the leaked data, or data, however you pronounce it. And do you have any comment about what could have been done differently? Any advice that you could give to your now colleagues there about how we should have handled it, so that, it's one thing pinpointing an issue, it's another thing learning from the experience. And as someone who was in the middle of all this, I suppose it would be helpful if you could share your learning experiences from how this could have been dealt with differently.
I would like to understand, and I don't as I sit here, why there weren't more criminal prosecutions. I'd like to understand that. I had always expected there to be more. I'm 3 years out of it, so I don't have the information. I'd like to understand what the difference would have been made had more resources been applied to the Falciani data.
And this would have been Solace's responsibility?
Absolutely.
So you think they could have been more vigorous in their pursuit?
I don't know the answer. I'd like to know. I mean, if you look around the world, I think only Ireland and the UK have prosecuted anyone from the Falciani list. That looks like a relatively miserable result. It'll be down to legal issues like the problems of proving evidence. But I think, if I may, and I hope Mrs. Homer doesn't get upset with me for this, I think there should be, someone should have a really good look as to whether any of that could have been done differently.
In your experience, gathered from a long time in the department, given your and the breadth of the experience, do you have a gut feeling that they should have been more vigorous? I mean, I don't necessarily want you to upset Ms. Homer, but she might be there to be upset.
Well, no. I mean, a criminal investigator in HMRC and in the two departments before it wants to succeed. They want to take the case to court. It's out of their hands when it gets there. Mm-hmm. They want to do the best job they can and present it in the best way we can. But I think, as I was saying to Mr. Burrows, the one thing I notice more than anything, and I've noticed it for probably 15 years, is that taxpayers tend not to plead guilty these days. There are judicial reviews of the evidence before the criminal trial starts, and things really, really get dragged out. The world has changed to the extent. But I just think that HMRC and other tax administrations should give some thought as to whether it would have been possible to move faster. I don't.
Are you saying
sorry,
on this, therefore, that I think you may have said this earlier, so forgive me, but you're saying that because of that change of climate,
yes,
it was rational to, as it were, worry less about prosecutions and worry more about getting the money, because that was a lower liability, a lower burden of proof, it was a civil matter, and therefore it was more likely to be successful. And that's what happened. But that nonetheless, you are, as it were, mildly surprised that there were so few prosecutions. I mean, I know that out of the 6,000 cases, I think 6,000 accounts, 2/3 of them were found to have no tax due anyway, but we're still talking about 2,000 where there was money due, there was tax due. You're saying that out of those 2,000, you're surprised that there weren't, in total, some more prosecutions?
More than one, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, I know, sticking a finger in the air, but
I don't know the answer.
As a percentage, I mean, what would be a reasonable number? I mean, I don't know whether it's 10% or 1%, even 1% would be 20. What would be an unsurprising number as a percentage?
I don't know the answer, Mr. Bacon, but I'm going to answer you in a different way, if I may. People with money hidden in Switzerland had a tendency, I don't know to what extent, to feel confident, certainly in Liechtenstein they felt this, to feel confident their money would never be uncovered and they'd never be identified. Some of them will have been investigated before, and some of them will have signed certificates of disclosure. And the approach of the UK tax administrations in the past was always to prosecute those cases as long as they were above a financial threshold. I'm surprised there were only 1, 2 or 3 who got into that position. But that's personal surprise.
I had a major insurance company whom I met recently who was saying that this was a slightly different domain, obviously, but the point is the same. There were cases where they were choosing to prosecute insurance fraud. This was in relation to whiplash injuries and so on, cash for crash as it's called, where they were taking a policy decision to prosecute even where the amount at stake was less than the legal costs in order to make a point very forcefully as a deterrent. Now, something we've said to HMRC for many years is, isn't there more you could do by way of deterrent than you are currently doing? Do you think that that is an accurate statement, that there is more that they should be doing by way of deterrent than they're currently doing?
I think there is certainly more today, because something else that has changed is the nation. I mean, this committee and others have woken the country up, if I may say, to the issue of tax fraud. and the nation is now interested in this issue. I can remember, if I go back 20 years, I can remember having terrible battles to get my media people to place the story of a successful prosecution with a sentence of more than 3 years with any newspaper at all, because tax was boring. It was a struggle. Thankfully, no longer.
I've got one more question, because I think the CNAG wants to come in. I'm sure that the fact that some of the cases involved celebrities and some of them involved very famous high street brands helped, and I hope this committee helped a bit as well. But the Office of Tax Simplification studied tax reliefs, and a total of 155 came under its gaze. And
155 what? Sorry.
Tax reliefs
Okay.
came under its gaze.
I remember.
And it recommended 47 of those should be abolished, and 43 actually were abolished. But the government also chose to introduce another 134 new tax reliefs. Now, this is straying dangerously close to the edge of the remit of this committee. In fact, if you answer the question fulsomely, it will be well beyond, but then I'm not responsible for your answers. And since you are no longer a government official, you can say whatever you like.
Not quite.
As long as it doesn't breach confidentiality. Broadly speaking, do you think that if we were to have a much simpler tax system, so that we didn't see the phenomenon that I've just described, that the benefits of doing that would outweigh the motives, the benefit of the motives that lead people to want to introduce new tax reliefs?
I want to give you a half-hour-long answer.
I know.
But let me try and do it very succinctly. I have no doubt that the shorter the tax code, the more coherent the tax code, the higher the level of compliance. As the Chair knows, I've just come back from working in a country whose tax code is really quite short. If the UK's is like that, this country's is like that. Unfortunately, even though it's like that, it's complex and people don't understand it. I think people need to be able to understand the tax code in order to have faith in it. So I'm with you that a simpler tax code would aid compliance.
Is it possible, this is my last question, I'm sorry. Is it possible, I mean, I think it is, but I'd be interested in the view of a tax expert. Is it possible in a large, complex, mature, internationally traded economy like ours to achieve anything like the kind of desirable level of simplicity, if there's enough political will to do it? Or is the world simply too complex? I'm
despondent. I think the world is too complex.
Right, I'm going to David very quickly and then to Amos.
Good question. I mean, your description of the change of culture and not pleading guilty, to show frustration, I'm a criminal defence solicitor, so from the magistrate's court point of view, you'll still see the same culture of people pleading guilty. There'll still be the deterrence on the small guys, but what you're talking about is a change of culture with the big guys, or girls, the big fish, whatever you want to call them. It's that culture. We're still getting the pleading guilty people at the low end in the magistrate's court. Yeah. That's still continuing. It's the other end where the big frustration is.
It's in the Crown Court. I don't know whether they're big fish or small fish, but I mean, I was responsible a long time ago for 20 prosecutions, 19 guilty pleas, 1 contested trial. Yeah. And some of the guilty pleas were big conspiracies.
I just I looked over the agreement. I saw that you talked about money laundering. Mm-hmm. Can I ask? It does strike me that looking at these transactions in Switzerland, they involve very large amounts of money, cash money being deposited and withdrawn from bank accounts, and with a cloak of confidentiality over individual transactions. Did anybody consider running a parallel investigation on money laundering to the one that you were looking at on tax? Were there any officials involved in looking at money laundering as all that information came out? I mean, it's really an information question. I'm not trying to... It's obviously not your responsibility, but I'm just... Given that you put it in the agreement and excluded... specifically kept people in liability for money laundering, I'm just interested to know if that got plumbed out. The rules are pretty stringent, after all.
Yeah, they are. Sir Amos, I don't know the answer. having said that, the governance body that I was describing to Ms. Hillier earlier on had a couple of money laundering specialists, HMRC money laundering specialists in there. But
So
I don't
just
know.
to pursue that one a little bit, because I think the whole point is in the Anglo-Swiss agreement, which you have taken responsibility for, you made special provisions for advisors. I mean, I assume banks would come in as advisors, would they, under the definition?
I think the Swiss, yes, paying collecting agents would be in banks, yes.
And they would be count as advisors in your definition in the agreement?
Yes.
Okay. What you then say, you didn't say we couldn't do it. What you actually say, or what is in the, if I actually read the extract, it says, Swiss paying agencies and their employers will need to comply with their legal obligations in respect of money laundering, interesting enough. Whilst it is never possible to provide an absolute assurance against criminal investigation, this is the interesting point, it is highly unlikely to be in the public interest of the United Kingdom that professional advisors, paying agents and employers will be subject to criminal investigation by HMRC. Highly unlikely to be in the public interest of the United Kingdom. What on earth brought that to you, knowing that you had the Falciani leaks?
That was really about what I was saying to Ms. Hillier earlier on, that the Swiss were determined there would be no prosecutions of Swiss bankers. We were determined that if we caught a Swiss banker within the scope of UK law doing something bad and we had evidence, we were determined that the Swiss agreement would not get them off the hook. Lawyers pored over this for weeks, Madam Chair.
It does get them off the hook. It says
No,
it
I don't
is-
think. I don't.
Whilst it is never possible to provide an absolute assurance, I understand that might be your off the hook bit. Again, it is highly unlikely to be in the public interest of the United Kingdom, not only the Swiss interest, the public interest of the United Kingdom, that professional advisors, Swiss paying agents and their employers will be subject to a criminal investigation by HMRC. I cannot see how that was in the UK public interest.
I don't remember the detail of the negotiation, but part of the thinking was that we were never going to get these guys. We were never going to get the quality of evidence to get them.
I can understand that, but there's still nothing to do with the UK public interest. It's not the UK public interest.
Things go into agreements when you're negotiating them that might not look perfect afterwards.
Austin.
Let's move on, because 2013, with the approval of the Committee for Business Appointments, you went on to work for HSBC Bank. Now, to me, this looks like a conflict of interest. Here is HMRC investigating wrongdoing by the bank's employees and clients. Here is the former head of HMRC taking a job with that same bank. Now, that looks odd, and in the view of my constituents in Grimsby, it might well stink. Why did you do it?
Well, for this reason, I was approached. I was approached by many people with offers of work after I retired, I was approached to join a committee that was looking to make the bank secure for the future after its difficulties in Mexico and in Switzerland. I have to say the idea of helping make a huge bank secure for the future appealed a lot to me. And working with the various people who are also advisors that I now work with. I believed in Mr. Gulliver's vision of sorting out the bank and making it one of the best in the world. I mean, I understood that the challenge was enormous, and I was prepared to be part of that. I followed the rules for taking appointments outside the civil service for permanent secretaries and other senior figures to the letter. Mrs. Homer checked it, her colleagues checked it, the Cabinet Office checked it, the committee checked it, and it went to the Prime Minister, and the Financial Conduct Authority also had to approve my appointment.
I accept all that, but you can't tell me that you sit there in the bank's canteen or in the office.
In the canteen.
Whatever you... Well, when you go there, they don't come along and say, look, Dave, we're in this mess. What do we do about it?
Well, that is about protecting the future. It's about using my...
No, but we've got this problem with HMRC. Now, you know all about HMRC.
Doesn't happen, Mr. Mitchell.
What are we going to do?
Doesn't happen. That would offend my integrity. I don't do that.
I think what is odd, I think what I find really odd about it is that you yourself said you had the choice. A lot of people were after you.
Yeah.
You could have gone to lots of banks, yet you chose to go to the one bank where there was substantial leaks, where you knew there was investigation, and where there are allegations of money laundering or tax evasion. Why? Why not choose one that, at least at this point, looks a bit cleaner than HSBC?
Because it wasn't the past of the bank that attracted me. It was trying to make it right for the future.
But the past of the bank tells you something about the character of the bank, doesn't it?
Well, it
Or
does, but
did you
the
just
character...
believe they were all into money laundering and tax
No,
evasion?
not at all, Madam Chair. The other thing that told me something about the bank was the leadership of the bank were determined to put things right, and I believe them.
And
Can I ask one from me would be a final question? I remember some years ago when you came before us, and I was quite surprised as a raw young socialist, with emphasis on young, that you said that your job was not to prosecute and intimidate the banks, not to be as tough as the American tax authorities, but to cultivate relationships, and that on that relationship basis, they would become better payers than if it was a hostile relationship. Now, was that Dave Hartnett's policy, or was that a policy dictated to you or suggested to you by government? We want to attract these big bastards, we want to attract all these wealthy people to come and invest in this country, so don't be hard on them, Dave. Cultivate a relationship, let's have friends. Whose policy was it?
In 2001, Mr. Mitchell, I was asked to do a study for government on the relationship between the UK tax administration and big business. Big business said the relationship was broken. They said it very quietly, but they clearly got through to government ministers, and we made a number of changes on the back of that. We never went soft. But then in 2000 and, forgive me, I'll get the year wrong, 5 or 6, we repeated the study to do things as well. And the changes that happened, some involved changes of law, but I mean it was a new approach which government took note of.
Thank you.
May I go back in time just for a second? Mr. Bacon said I could now do what I liked. I want to go back to an earlier hearing where you told me you were going to run a nail bar and something alongside it. I won't push it any further.
I think my final question to you is quite sort of appropriate that our final hearing this Parliament is with you, because it was our first hearing with you that started us on our journey as a committee on the whole issue of tax avoidance, which I just think is an issue that will be taken on in future Parliaments. Whether it's fair or not, you are associated, I think personally, more than probably any other individual in government, with what was the old culture of doing things which people now regard as completely unacceptable. What's your biggest regret?
I think my biggest regret is probably around the process for settling large cases with big business, that I should have thought more about the process. I was confident that the substance was right, and Sir Amias with Sir Andrew Park confirmed that, but I wish I'd got the process better organised, and I understand it has changed since.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.